QSO Today, episode 316, Michael Walker, VA3MW. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver. My thanks to ICOM America for being a sponsor of the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, VA3MW, your host. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is still in the on-demand mode. This means that all of the content is still available from both the auditorium, where we have over 60 great amateur radio presentations, and in the exhibit hall, where you can get most of the up-to-date information from the vendors that participated in the event. The expo will remain open until September 9th. Most of the speakers at the expo had been my guest on the QSO Today podcast. However, there were about 10 that I had not interviewed. So in this vein, I want to bring you this week Michael Walker, VA3MW. Michael is now widely known as FlexRadio's inside salesperson, but you will also hear him now on the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast. VA3MW is my QSO Today. VA3MW, this is Eric, VA3MW. Are you there, Michael?
VA3MW, VA3MW. Good day, Eric. How are you?
I'm good, Michael. Thank you. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
So it started in my youth, like most of us back in the 70s. I think I was 14 or 15. And I honestly can't remember what got me the first, aha moment. But I do remember it had to do with Scouts. And I did a lot with the scouting program as a kid. I thought it was an amazing program back then, and it was in a small town in North Bay, which is about 50,000 people, located about 3 hours north of Toronto here in Ontario. And they had, we had so much outdoor stuff that I guess eventually radio entered into camping and finding people and communicating. And it might have been CB on Channel 11, but I think that's what it started in. And then I realized there was more.
There was a merit badge, wasn't there, for Boy Scouts for the Morse code or for communications?
Yeah, it was part of a program. In the U.S. was a little bit different than Canada, but there were badges for that are related. So that's what definitely got me interested. I remember being out in the woods and trying to find some people or just communicate with them. And there's a lot of woods up there.
So radio is the ideal thing to have when you're in the woods and you're by yourself. Did you have an interest in electronics even before that?
Yeah, I did. I remember cycling around with a big Ampex tape recorder on my bike so I could listen to music. Maybe I should have invented these MP3 players back then, but they didn't exist. So I am amazed looking back at the power of being able to take music with you. I loved headphones, and I remember my clock radio didn't have a headphone jack on it. With some help, I figured out how to drill a hole and mount a 1/8 inch, headphone jack on it, and actually solder it, and didn't melt too much on it. A few things, but I got it to work.
And did you have a soldering iron, or did you use a wood burning tool?
No, I had a soldering iron by then, and so that's where I figured out that somebody had to put this all together. And my mom, who's passed, has long since told people that whatever Christmas gift I got, it had to come apart.
Did you build electronic kits?
Yeah, many of them. The Heath kit. I think Radio Shack had some kits back then.
Tandy kits or something like that.
Tandy did. The Battery of the Month Club got me into the store because I needed batteries. That's probably where it all spun out. It was really... and then you eventually find friends in high school that have the same interest.
So how did you get your first license? Was there some mentor or someone like that kind of said, hey, this is the direction to go?
So I ultimately found some local hams, just a bit older than me, at my high school, and learned that there was an actual ham radio club, and they had classes. And of course, my mother was wondering what I was hanging around with all these older gentlemen about, which I guarantee you stressed her out. But it worked out okay. In Canada, then your amateur license for your basic was a written test, and you had to know the schematic and stuff of a radio, most of which I can still draw today. And one of my mentors, Carl, V3EKR, taught me most of the front end of a receiver all the way through to the speaker while paddling in a canoe with no pencil and paper. And what an amazing way to commit it to memory. And that took about a day and a half.
Now, you've talked about canoes before. What is it with Canadians and canoes?
I think it's just there's just so much water up here, and it's a way to get off the grid. I own a couple of canoes, but I grew up again up there, being able to where there's a lot of woods and things, and the ability to get away from it all, even if all was high school or school and your parents or everything else, and go off the grid really became a passion of mine then, with a couple of other friends, an amazing high school program that allowed us to do that. And we were gone for a week at a time. So you'd come back, and can you imagine being gone at a week at a time at the height of COVID and come back and ran into this?
Not at all. So when did you get your first license, and what was your call sign?
My first license was about 1974, and my call was Victor Echo 3 Hotel Quebec Whiskey. And then they were submitted or released in sort of in alphabetical order. So depending when you just showed up, you got the next one. And it was, HQ sort of was our area. So we had all of them, W, V, X, Y, Z, et cetera.
What was the level of license, and what was it called then?
It was a basic license, and your call sign doesn't change. You have it for life back then, unless you chose to change it. So if you then got your advanced, there was only 2 levels. Back then it was the written test, there was theory, and there was also Morse code 10 words a minute, and the next test was 15.
For the advanced, so with the basic license, you had Morse code at 10 words a minute and a theory test. Was there a limitation on the operating bands and modes that you could operate with a basic license?
Yes, you had above 30 megahertz, and which included 6 meters, if I remember correctly, but nobody was on 6. You had full privileges. You could run CW phone or any other modulation scheme you could come up with that was defined by the RICs. But below that was only CW. So from 160 through to 10 meters, it was only CW. Then after 6 months, if you walked into the Industry Canada office with your logbook and showed the inspector that you were active, he would give you a 10-meter endorsement, which would allow you to get onto 10 meters. Beyond that, you then had to go for an advanced test, which was more theory, more regs, and faster CW.
So the basic license was really a code-only license for the most part.
For HF, correct. Yes, because VHF was really new then, and repeaters were just starting to come out.
Do you remember your first rig?
My first HF rig, absolutely. It was given to me by one of my Elmers. It was a Heathkit HR10B and a DX40 receiver, and it had a TR switch that was part of the going in and out of transmit. And I wish I had a picture of it today, but it had a big yellow handle on it, so you really had to flop it with your hand to go from transmit to receive. It was quite an effect because everything would go clunk. So I did a lot of CW on that, very poorly. I struggled with CW. It would do AM, but I never did any AM. But I certainly worked a number of people, and I actually still have that paper logbook.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Absolutely. I left high school and went into aircraft electronics, and that was at Canada College in North Bay, and that was 100% related to another Elmer, Arnold, V3DPI, who was also an instructor there. It was one of the things he brought forward and goes, look, you'll really like this stuff, and I got a chance to do tours ahead of time, and couldn't really afford to go to university at the time, so college was my second choice, and it worked out really well. And
what's the difference between university and college in Canada? Because I think, when we think about it in America, it seems to be the same thing.
There's a big difference. The university programs are well known. They're multi-year programs, and you generally come out with a degree. Generally, the college programs set you up for the workforce in one way or another. They're 1 to 2, maybe 3-year programs, whether it's nursing, teachers college, in my case, avionics. And so they're more focused on the workforce as well, and a little bit faster, a little less money. And these community colleges, there's a few more of them than the universities, at least through Ontario.
Once you graduated from this college, where did the knowledge take you? And was ham radio involved in that?
Again, absolutely. And ham radio took care of about 80% of my jobs, if not more, through then and to the day. It's amazing the impact amateur radio has. I got hired by IBM, believe it or not, and again, through an amateur radio reference. And in North Bay is a NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command site, and it's 600 feet under granite rock in North Bay, and it's the sister to Cheyenne Mountain. So by now it's 1979, and it's the height of the Cold War. And they had a computer down there that IBM had the contract to maintain, and there was two computers actually, both about the size of a hockey rink, and both with about 64,000 tubes in them. And so we got trained on the internals of how to keep this computer running, and a whole number of other things that we weren't as well educated in what was going on in world stuff unless it showed up in the paper back then. So imagine being 19 and getting on a bus that goes down a 3,000 foot road that takes you 600 feet underground to a series of blast doors, and now you're part of the Cold War.
I remember IBM service guys in those days. IBM required that they wear suits with vests and polished shoes to service IBM computers. Was that the situation with you in the NORAD base there?
Almost. We didn't have to wear a jacket, but we certainly had to wear shoes, pants, and a tie, and it wasn't always a white shirt, but at least we had to look above what we would call today much above business casual.
What happened after that?
So we were there for 3 years, and ultimately that site got decommissioned, and IBM moved me to Toronto, where I moved into the software world of mainframes and got trained in, let me remember here, VTAM. The IBMers will be laughing because that was quite an amazing product, and MVS and a bit of VM until the PC came out, which was, when did that? About 1982.
So did you work on like System 34s, System 38s, things like that?
It's funny. I remember the code name for System 44. It was called Sunglow, but I didn't work on it. But we actually had one of those down under in NORAD because I think it did some payroll or something. But they had 8-inch floppy drives. I was not part of that. No, I went right from this, this machine that produced, that required 20 tons of cooling a day to run, to working and trying to understand a mainframe environment and how multiple users would be able to have access to certain virtual machines. Some of that hasn't changed today.
And how did your ham radio career parallel the work that you were doing as you're moving up the ladder in IBM?
So it sort of paused. Ham radio got me into IBM and NORAD. They had a number of hams working in the NORAD site, and so that's where the reference came from. There was a pause there from my middle to late 20s where I was being trained on the internals of different systems, such as the mainframe stuff, the MVS programs of the world, IMS and KICS, etc. So there was a bit of a pause there, and I'd also moved into Toronto, which is now, like moving into let's say San Francisco, and there just wasn't the room for the antennas, and there was a big switch from HF, which I loved, into just being able to be on FM and VHF and 220 and 440 in the Toronto area because I spent so much time commuting in the car. And so HF took a bit of a sidetrack for a number of years until I managed to find a group of high-tech people that were part of the Toronto FM Communications Society who had built and designed one of the first multi-linking computer systems or repeater systems available, so much so that the processes and the hardware was actually published in the IEEE magazine.
What was the topology of that system? Was that a wide area system, statewide system?
It was and wasn't. It was, the heart of it was northeast of Toronto at a ski hill called Skyloft. And essentially it was a 68HC11 microprocessor that had the ability to talk to 8 receivers and 8 transmitters at the same time and listen to all of those. And then, of course, you paired those into repeaters and links. In parallel to that, there was a linking system which took it to various areas south of Toronto into Buffalo and north into northern Ontario and east and west. through a common hub system, as well as there was a repeater system installed on the CN Tower. And for the longest time, the tallest building in the world looking over Toronto. And they're still there today with 2 repeaters in that tower. And I'd honestly believe today we'd never be able to get back in there. But the linking system was very unique because it had the ability to do multiple links at the same time. So say you could have 2 meters linked to 220 at the same time, have 6 linked to 10, and them not having to share that information. The other key thing in this link system is it had the ability to not only initiate an outbound link, but also hear an inbound link. And once I was part of this group, I was amazed that is actually a pretty difficult thing to do, is that you could passively listen on the inbound link. Today, it's not a problem, but then it was really hard.
And did this system also head across Canada, or did it kind of confine itself to Ontario?
It confined itself to Ontario until I think it was about the 90s when it picked up IPARN, which was an invention or a thought of, and I apologize, I can't remember his call sign, a VE7 from BC, that was able to get repeater systems linked via satellite so that we could link all the provinces. And this is pre-internet. Today, it's no problem. But back then, we had the IPARN system linked to many other many other repeaters in all provinces of Canada. And that was really quite impressive.
And it seems to me that the reason that you'd use a satellite link rather than terrestrial point-to-point links is because you have long stretches of rural areas where you're trying to link, or is Canada flat in the middle?
Canada's flat in the middle like U.S., but it spans 4 time zones, so it's pretty wide. And just about 50% of Canada's population is in a very compact area, sort of along Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence. And then the rest of it scattered through major centers. And then what's left, the little 10% is all over the country. But it's huge. It covers the entire top part of the United States. Here to drive sort of to the mountains from here is a good 3-day drive just to get to Calgary, and you still haven't crossed into the last province yet.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get out and be active with ICOM's new IC705 and its optional multifunction backpack. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion, as it has many of the same base station features and functionality of ICOM's bigger rigs. At the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilo or just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. The ICOM IC705 has a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall, similar to the IC7300. I can't wait to get my IC705 to use as a baseband rig for satellites and microwave projects, including the S-HALE geosynchronous satellite. The ICOM IC705 puts out 5 watts with its BP272 battery pack and a full 10 watts when connected to an external 13.8-volt power supply. The rig does single sideband, CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Other features include micro USB connector, Bluetooth and wireless LAN over Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, a micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment. As this is the perfect QRP or QRPP rig, the perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional LC192 backpack with its special compartment for the IC705 and room for accessories for SOTA activations or just a day social distancing in the park. For more information on this fabulous new rig, click on the banner in this week's show notes. And when you go to buy your new ICOM IC705, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsorship of the QSO Today podcast. I guess all I have to do is look at a map and realize how amazing that is. Okay, so you're active in VHF and UHF in the Toronto area. How did your ham radio career then evolve where you end up back in on HF?
A couple of things. I had gotten to know the owner of the local ham store. Then it was Atlantic Ham Radio, and I was looking for a change. So he ultimately hired me as his store manager, and that was back in 1991. At the same time, then I got to know different people. Active hams that had serious contest stations, and also a good friend of mine, Ken VA3SK, who was living in northern Ontario of Timmins, was setting up a contest station. So he invited me up there to operate a contest. It was my first one. And imagine my first contest was CQ Worldwide. And he had a contesting background. And that's where I got the bug. I just loved the sideband contesting and a bit of RTTY. But yeah, that was 1991. And, 48 hours in the seat. We were not even multi-single, just single. But we had a 40-meter beam. And I was amazed at what I'd heard things I'd never heard before. I didn't think you could work so many people in an HF weekend.
And did you become a contester after that?
That was it. Then it was all about, because I had a competitive side to me from racing sailboats and stuff. So this just sat me down another vertical of how can we do this better, faster, easier.
What contests have you worked, and do you continue to work them?
I continue to work CQ Worldwide. I haven't been in WPX for a while because it started to impact with, I do a lot of things, Eric, but it started to impact with some ski racing where I do technical work with ski racing. And so the wintertime would often get sucked up by events on the weekend in the ski racing world. That happened about the mid-90s as well. So I would leave time for the major contests or the VHF contests because now I'm set up to do it. And then I was as well. I'd put up a 2-meter beam and got into 2-meter sideband. So if I didn't get it in the calendar, unfortunately, I didn't get on every weekend like some people do in contests. But what spun out of contesting even back then was the integration, the cat control. It was my TS 690, and that we could have CT logging actually read the frequency. And I could see the writing on the wall there where, the PC, even back then, for those that were that leading edge and not on paper, the radio's now starting to move its way away a little bit from the operating position, and the keyboard's now front and center. And that's when that started back about 1992 or 3.
It was a Kenwood TS 690. And cat control, for people that aren't aware, is kind of a standard for controlling the radio from PC software.
Correct.
It's serial control, as I recall.
And it still is today. But, I think before, when you were logging, you had 2 people in dupe sheets, and scoring was, of course, incredibly complex by paper. I could see that our accuracy would go up immensely just by making sure we had the right band and frequency and time on the logbook.
So CT logging is a logging software?
CT is one of the first logging programs I'm familiar with, and it ran on DOS, and it was it just worked really well. And then the next step is K1TTT wrote a driver for that allowed 2 DOS PCs to communicate with each other like a network. And so you could have 2 stations sharing their logging information.
This integration of computers and cat control and radios seemed to kind of light a fire under you.
Yeah.
It's kind of evolved since then. So what happened after that?
Well, it just got, we built the Corbeil Contest Club, which was at Ken's father-in-law's place in North Bay, which is outside of North Bay. It was quiet, had no internet. So we had to rely for years on packet radio for DX cluster spots long after people were using it. But there was no internet anywhere nearby. And of course, data on a phone didn't really exist or was even practical. So we were beaming on 14439 out of the city of North Bay, 15 miles or 20 plus kilometers to us so we could get packet data. And so this integration always continued. Each contest was, well, what can we do more? Now we can get 2 stations talking. And then eventually Windows came out. We didn't use Windows 3.1.1, but I guess it was 95 came out. And now the LANs started to appear in the ham shacks, and the amplifiers started to, or the bandpass filter started to automatically switch because you had to have those, because the radios now didn't have the front ends and the isolation they have today. So even 20 and 40 was hard at times because you could hear the other guy. But then we got to the ability to turn antennas by sending it a command rather than sitting there with your finger on it while you're trying to do QSOs. And of course, you would shoot past where you were going. So that integration kept getting more and more. And then there was more antennas. And then your run station had, different antennas that your multi-station had. But so you had to the 2x8 switches we have today didn't exist. So there was these horrifically complicated manual switching charts on walls that you would get up and change antennas so that the run station could have one particular antenna and the multi-station could have a different one.
One of the things I've noticed, if you look up somebody on QRZ.com, that there's information that gives their coordinates and their direction from you. Does any of this logging software actually refer to that information that's there in QRZ so that it turns the beam in the direction of the contact that you're working? Are we becoming that sophisticated in contesting to be able to control the antenna direction from knowing who you're talking to?
We could do that today. It would be very easy, but I think you would find that the antennas are always spinning. So you would have to come up with, an algorithm that says if 90 degrees, then turn. But you still want to, I guess, approve that command before it goes. Packet clusters have the ability to actually give you that beam heading today, given what they know of you and what's in the databases of people on the packet cluster. Generally, if you, even in N1MM, the program that most people use today, it pops up if I type in your call sign, it'll give me your bearing just to 4Z, to Israel. So I'll know that, maybe I should turn. In a contest, I generally won't move a beam unless I'm really need you as a contact, or, and I'm trying to get every ounce of gain. And of course, HF beams are so broad that 30 or 40 plus degrees that, you've got to be way out of alignment before you're actually going to spin it. And that takes time. We're there. We could do it today.
So when you're not working a contest, are you chasing DX?
Yeah, I've done a lot less contesting lately, but it's been more DXing, and I'm just more about increasing my DXCC country count. So that's where I've been the last couple of years since the current job. And I think part of that's certainly related to the job, but more of the focus has been DXing and more station integration and mentoring now where I can.
When did you become interested in software-defined radio?
That's a good question. I saw that, I think it was the Flex 3000 was the first one I saw. And there was a 1000 before it, which I wasn't really aware of. But when I saw the ability to, the technology had changed away from semiconductors and into things like field programmable gate arrays. And so I was in the SDR world for some people a little late, but I could see that if things changed, you didn't have to buy a new radio anymore. They just sent you new software. And it's like getting a new radio now and then for free, or, even with a license in today's world. But, I'm going to sort of pick on ICOM. I've said this story many times, but I had the ICOM 756 Pro, and I actually thought that would be the last radio I would ever own because I couldn't really afford the FD1000D when it came out, which was a great radio. Of course, and then there was a Pro 2, so then I had to sell the Pro 1 and pay full price for the Pro 2. And then there was a Pro 3, so you get the idea. There was a lot of money invested in upgrading and staying current. And as we move forward today, you're going to see that's what drove it for me. And then I also saw that there was going to be, we didn't know what the future was then. I just knew that the door wasn't closed. In fact, it was opening up for this technology.
Did you try any of the software-defined radio dongles? Did you experiment with some of the chipsets or dongles as a way to get involved in software-defined radio?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, who couldn't shell out $25 for an RT dongle and have a receiver that goes from 25 meg up to, I forgot what the high limit was, but yeah, that was I worked at home a lot because I was working for a software company then, and I was also a road warrior, but that was always on the computer I was using in case I wanted to listen to either FM broadcast or a repeater or just poke around and see what was happening. And I that's where I really cut my teeth on what things could do, and with the amazing power of the RT, I guess it was the RTL dongle, but great receiver, no front end, no overload protection, but wow, look at this.
And what kind of software did you use with it? in order to be able to have that flexibility?
Oh, it must have been, I can't remember, Eric. It was probably the predecessor to SDR Play, or maybe that was it. I'd have to Google it and look.
Because it's my understanding, and I don't have a lot of understanding, but it's my understanding with people who use the RT dongle and SDR software that if you want to listen to like trunked radio, for example, or some of the stranger digital radio formats, that you actually need some additional software to layer on top in order to be able to do that. Or is that now part of the SDR software suites?
I think that once you get into the trunked radio and the encryption, then yeah, you'll probably need some extra software. I didn't really go down much past that route. It doesn't really even interest me to hear the services that much. So I'm probably not your best person to ask on that. Don't know, but it's not built in. That's what at least it wasn't when I was using it.
Hey, this is Eric for just another short break. One of my favorite Ham Radio podcasts is the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, hosted by George, KJ6VU, my guest in episode 232, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ. George and Jeremy take a bi-weekly deep dive into their favorite Ham Radio Workbench projects and the technologies that fascinate them. If you want to be a ham radio builder or just be inspired, click on the link in this week's show notes page.
We've actually spoken a few times now because of the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, and you tell me that you're actually in a summer house. But could you talk about what's the current rig, the daily driver, and how is it configured?
So I have two. Both of them are Flex. So at the HF station is a 6600. That's the remote one. And a PGXL amplifier. Amazing combination. And so that's my HF one on it almost every day. Lately, as we get into this time of the year, I've been doing a lot more 60-meter FT8, DXing. And then at the house in the city where VHF is sort of easier to do and it seems to handle the noise floor a bit better, although it's not great, is another Flex, a 6600M, that I use for VHF, UHF, and satellite.
And not even use the HF portion of it.
No, there is nothing below. I don't even have 6 meters anymore because I have too many neighbors on 6, so I just do 6 meters remotely. So I have two transmitters hooked up to it, one for VHF and one for UHF.
Well, I saw a quote someplace from you that said, any place that has good HF operating has crappy internet.
Yeah, that's very true.
Is that still the case?
Yes, absolutely. And I've got some friends, again, in Northern Ontario that are just struggling to get any solid internet, 1 or 2 or 3 meg down. But tell you what, they've got great HF. And for the most part, that's pretty true. In the city, HF is not usable for me. And yet, I've got 500 meg of internet. So generally, it seems to work.
Do you remotely control the system in the city?
I can. It's set up to do that. The Flex remote control is built in, so I can connect to it. And I can even control my satellite antennas from here at the cottage if I wanted to, or get on a 2-meter or UHF sideband.
So let's talk a little bit about the Flex 6600 that you've got there up in the cottage. You actually made a presentation to the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo about your remote base station. I think they're becoming more prevalent. You might have been the trendsetter. But what is the special challenge of building a remote base station in a remote cottage, especially an HF station?
So there's many. I've been at this since about 2005. Like most of us, I've learned through the school of hard knocks. Failing is a learning experience. And I want to tell a lot of ham operators that please do not be afraid to try something. It may or may not work. But it's an education, and it's a great education. And I think a lot of today's hams are afraid to push a button or try something because they might break it. I've broken a lot of things, I guess, and learned a few things, but that's all positive. So the HF station I have here, and from day one, it's the key component of it is also the weakest link and the strongest link, and that's the internet that goes with it. And there are times it's absolutely flawless. And as you heard earlier, as we started this podcast before we started recording, we actually had some challenges with it where it's just not seamless and we can't control it. So that's sort of the biggest hurdle. So you need to do everything you can to rely less and less on it as your transmission method. So I do everything I can to not send data out to the internet if I don't really have to. And I think the other thing that really drove that was in the early days when I got the internet here at the cottage, and all I could get was 5 megabits down and barely 1 meg up. But I wanted to use this HF station. I really had to go on a diet and really look at what was being sent out to the internet. And so that was the thing I had to really understand and make stable. Today, not so hard, but it's still a component. And I also immediately learned, because I thought this will be easy. I'll just put this here and do a bit of Wi-Fi over there. And that's where I really started to learn that Wi-Fi is truly unreliable. And I say at work that Wi-Fi is evil. And so yeah, that's the bigger one, Eric, is just if you can get in today's radio world, if you can get the data from the radio in a reliable state, you're in really good shape. The rest is not as can be as difficult, but certainly is not as impactful.
Well, it seems to me that 5/1 internet seems to be like it would be more than enough to successfully operate an amateur radio station. What's the issue out in the woods there? Do you have a lot of latency? And latency is how fast a packet moves from one place to the other. What was the issue out there?
So in the early days of my remote station, I had a TS480 PC, and I ran Ham Radio Deluxe. It had a client-server mode that allowed you to connect remotely. You could call in, and it would connect the radio. It worked really well. It didn't use much internet, as you were saying. And then I switched over to the remote rig solution for my TS480, and it worked really well. And for rag chewing and stuff, but the TS480 really is not a contest grade radio. But the technology to move the data was pretty good. And then in parallel, of course, I had this SDR radio at home, and I was doing a little bit of HF when I could, or just getting used to it. And I became a band. I fell in love with the waterfall just for band awareness, just to know what was going on. And even today, using satellite, I get to see who else is on the satellite. Hey, there's a guy just up there. I don't have to go looking for him. But so as my HF station became more and more diversified here at the cottage, the turning on of the pan adapter and the waterfall required more bandwidth. And as you got closer to that 1 meg limit, your bandwidth, your upload, because you're now a server, you're now serving data to an outside user, then you started to impact your upload stream. And that's something people don't look at today. If you put internet in, you really don't care what the upload stream is unless it's part of your commercial business. Maybe you're a photographer or a videographer or something, and you're uploading things, and they're big files. But for most of us, it isn't an issue. But now, the radio being the server, I need that upstream data. And it wasn't until last year that one I could upgrade to 5. And it's, what year is this now? It was 2019 when the local cable company said, hey, we can give you 5 megabytes upstream now.
And what's the condition of LTE in Ontario, and especially up where you are? Is that an alternate or another way of getting an internet connection now?
No, technically it'll work. It's still hugely latent. I think probably because of the geography we span. The cell towers are incredibly high. They serve in huge areas, but there's no unlimited. There's no really good data plan. Because of the geography in Canada and the huge infrastructure, what we pay for cell phones far exceeds a lot of others in different parts of the world. And I'm sure there's studies out there that say Canada is like the second most expensive cell coverage or cell phone world, for cost. And so LTE is not really anything viable unless you were just going to use it for a command and control link. And if you're going to set up a remote, you don't really want to be worrying about, how much data did I go through on the weekend.
What are the other issues it seems to me that if you've got an HF station up in a cabin and you've got snow and you happen to be back in the city, what are the other issues that you have to deal with in order to make sure that you don't have to get out the four-wheel drive and the chains and drive back up to reboot something? Well,
it was funny how you put that. So how many times at the first call to your ISP, what's the first thing they ask you to do? Reboot, power cycle, everything. So that was also one of my first failure points back in 2005. The system ran well for 6 or 7 weeks. Oh, and by the way, I'd leave the place mid-October and then don't come back until Easter weekend, sometime in April, or sometime after the third week of March. And sure enough, somewhere about middle of December, everything goes offline. And I go, okay. So I phone the cable company, and wonderful company. They're called Cable. So I phone the cable company, and the guy calls me back because you have to leave a message. And he goes, no, it's okay. It's an easy fix. I go, great. What is it? Yeah, just unplug your modem and plug it back in. So, of course, that wasn't really practical. So on the drive up here in the dark, I stopped at, I think I told the story just the other day, at Canadian Tire, which is our hardware chain, and picked up a timer generally that we use for lights, and plug this in. And now the modem's going to reboot every day at 3:30 in the morning. So just in case, that's a simple fail-safe. That's now been replaced with a Raspberry Pi that now checks every 20 minutes if the internet's out, and then toggles a GPIO port and turns all the power off and back on. And even today you can buy these switches on Amazon that do exactly that, already canned and ready to go.
Well, you'll have to share a link with us for a device like that. I myself also use these 24-hour timers. Every place I've got a LTE modem that's being used like as a link for a radio or something like that in a radio site where there's no internet. Because for some reason, at least every once in a while, you have to reboot the whole thing. So that sounds like that was a pretty good solution.
It was, and it probably stayed in place for 10 years. The only maintenance required was making sure the time was correct.
That's right. If you have power failures, then obviously the time would not be correct after a while.
Correct.
It might lose an hour or two, right? What are the other issues? It seems to me that antennas that fail, high SWR, lightning storms, how do you deal with things like that?
So antennas have been incredibly reliable. I'm generally here through the summer, so I do all my antenna maintenance during the summer. But winter, they fail. And I don't, every time I change bands, and I say I haven't used the station or I haven't used that band in a while, I double check the frequency or the SWR. And if the SWR is good and I hear signals, the antenna is probably okay. And, but maybe that comes from the pilot in me. Like every time I change bands, even in a contest, I pause for a minute and make sure that is that antenna working the way it is. Now, it's not that big a deal because any radio today is incredibly well protected. And an open antenna or a shorted antenna or, an SWR greater than 3-to-1, the radio is going to protect itself. And it's been a long time since I've heard of a high SWR actually take out a radio. So you just don't work anybody, and all of a sudden your power's being folded back and shut down. The biggest one that we still haven't really solved today is lightning. And we have lightning here. And, how do you, there's just no app that throws the coax out the window that you can pick up in the morning. So there's a couple of solutions there. And the little relay switches that people have that ground everything, they're okay for nearby static pulses, or if you ever look at the anatomy of a lightning strike, the feeder pulses that might, it might ground those. I have arc plugs on everything. Those are those little square things with UHF connectors on each side and a plug inside, and they're designed to create a short to the antenna system. And I've pulled them out, by the way, and they arc. When they get hit, they're marked, and mine are all marked. They're all been used. And I really need to go check and see if they're destroyed and not usable. So it's one of my maintenance things to change those out from time to time. There is a solution on the internet that I have tinkered with building, and I still might do it, that has your feed lines on a bar and then a linear actuator, which is pulls these UHF connectors apart. It's sort of a press fit UHF connector, 6 or 7 inches. And while it may not be protection in a serious strike, I think you're going to find in the lighter events that ability is a big deal. However, that doesn't help you with LAN cables and DC power cables and AC power lines, all of which are antennas and have the ability to cause damage or be part of damage from a lightning strike. And a friend of mine just went through that 2 weeks ago in the city of Toronto. Everything that was LAN connected was destroyed just due to the electromagnetic pulse from the lightning strike.
Well, I've actually seen, from my experience, that a lot of lightning actually comes in on phone lines. So if you've got overhead phone lines, or you've got, in the case of our little community here where I live, the central office is actually at the top of the hill next to a water tank. And I remember it getting wiped out, but it also sent a nice pulse down the phone lines to a lot of devices like fax machines and things like that that got wiped out, cordless phones. What does that look like? Do you have above ground utilities there like telephone lines? How do you handle those?
We have had telephone lines, and they've been damaged, but with the advent of cellular, that's not an issue. Television we get now on satellite, but we'll probably even terminate that because most of it comes in the one piece of feed line that the cable internet's on. That has the required grounding on both ends, but I think a nearby strike we'd probably be damaged. Interestingly enough, this is a very old building, this cottage that we're in, and that was back in the day when you actually put lightning rods on everything. And so every building here has lightning rods on it and big ground braids into the ground. And I think that's created a bit of its own shield because if you ever do any reading on the anatomy of a lightning strike, of course it's about voltage differential. And if you can do anything to bleed off that ground static, then you reduce that voltage differential. So I'm sort of hoping that all these little pointy things, and there's probably a couple of dozen of them around the property here, help bleed off my ground static, and so that I don't actually get a strike here. We've had a couple since I've been here, and they've destroyed trees. But interestingly enough, we had one on the property about, 200 feet from the boathouse, and where all the equipment is, and not far from my 80-meter antenna, and there was no damage.
And of course, you have the ARRL insurance just in case.
No, I have the mic insurance because in Canada we can't the ARRL insurance. House insurance up here will cover
equipment damage from lightning strike.
Yeah, and I don't know though. I suspect they'd pull it the first time I claimed it with about $100,000 worth of electronics. They'd probably want to ask questions.
We do want to mention that you actually work for FlexRadio now.
Correct.
We could talk a little bit about that. How did you end up at Flex?
I was an annoying customer. I got to know them. They're an incredible bunch of people. And I know you haven't had a chance to get to Dayton yet, but if you have been to Dayton when Flex was there, they spent a lot of time talking to their customers, and so they got to know me. And I was always sort of pushing the envelope on what the hardware could do, and I've long since learned there's a lot of customers that push the envelope in a good way and challenge us. And I was challenging Flex then. The likes of Eric and Steve Hicks and et cetera, would actually spend time talking to me and listened, and some ideas made it back, and which is how I got to know them. And it also, because I came from a customer service background from IBM, that whole customer service thing had a big impact on me, and I couldn't do that with ICOM Kenwood Yaesu, and I had limited usage on the Elecraft line, as great as it is. And I just, even as a dealer in the 90s when I was a manager at Atlantic Ham Radio, there were many things the radio should have done better, but I could never get that data, that feedback back to the product manager in Japan. It's like North America didn't exist. You'd get this and go, geez, well, what are they thinking? That doesn't work. And yet this is what sort of took me down on the Flex radio path. When did I start that? About early, I can't remember, probably mid 2000 or so. And so I ultimately became, as they say, looking for a new opportunity in late 2017 or so. And I had reached out to Matt, one of the VPs, and said, hey, I was looking, do you need support people? And they didn't really need anybody. But they had come to a Hamfest here in Ontario, and I had said, well, let me come out and help you. And it was the Brampton Hamfest, and so I went and helped at their booth. They had a really slick traveling booth that worked incredibly well. And I guess Matt saw me interfacing with customers and talking to people, and I certainly knew the product. And so about a month or two later, he called me and said, geez, how would you like to do our inside sales for North America? And, answer the phone and take orders and be a knowledge point. And that just took off. like through my whole career, I think other than one job, ham radio has been a part of it.
Well, one of the things that I think that most people don't realize is that Flex also is not just a ham radio company, that it has very interesting other customers. Are you able to talk about that at all?
I can talk about what's in the press releases. So Flex has been part of a significant HF radio replacement in the U.S. Air Force. So they are designing new hardware for airplanes, and it looks like, from what little they tell me, because I am a Canadian, that they like what they see, and because it's still in the development phase and it's a phased approach. And I think if I was the buying agent on the other side, it would have to be because the hardware's incredibly future proof, so that if the military was to come up with a new waveform or a new modulation scheme, that, geez, maybe that's pretty easy to implement right into the hardware without trying to stick. Prior to SDR, we would do it with a modem or a PC, right? When we came up with new digital modes, it wasn't in the radio. So who knows? Encryption.
It's kind of scary. They'd say like the F-35, which is this tactical forward-striking jet fighter that's made in America. That whole thing is also practically connected to the internet and software-defined. All of its avionics and things like that. So it seems to me that that's a natural progression, that the entire panel could become a glass panel with no knobs. We saw something like that just recently with the Falcon, a SpaceX Falcon. That thing has no knobs and buttons.
Yeah, no kidding. Look at the Falcon. It's 2 iPads essentially. It's a little bit more, but let's put this in perspective, Eric. You've got your cell phone nearby. Imagine if your cell phone was built with traditional semiconductors. How big do you think that would be? It's an SDR radio, and we really don't care today what happens between the antenna and the speaker, other than the RF is turned into audio so we can use it.
What do you think is the greatest challenge to amateur radio now that you're sitting in the sales seat at FlexRadio and you talk to a lot of hams every day? What do you think the greatest challenge is now?
I'm really starting to understand what different nationalities that are shrinking go through. It's the same thing. In Canada, I know for sure that the average age of the amateur is increasing, and that's not good. We need that decreasing for longevity. So while we are getting youth on it, and I think we're getting some resurgence in the U.S. where we're getting more youth involved in amateur radio, and whether that's HF or ballooning or APRS or FM or whatever, maybe all those are the gateway drug to the rest of amateur radio. And as you know, there's so much to amateur radio. There's just not one thing. And so, yeah, youth. We need more youth, and probably by youth I mean under 40. In asking questions and not being afraid of it, and then that's our biggest challenge. Is I don't think we're open enough and inviting, and I think we can all contribute more to bring more people into the technology and what it can do.
Do you have any ideas how would you bring those young people in, at least to be able to make the pitch?
So what I know has been working so far is, believe it or not, our YouTube videos. And we can see some of the demographic ages by who watches it. We have that ability now to see that. And so by communicating at, I'm going to say at that level, is certainly a positive thing. It's hard to get them out to field day and see stuff because that's not their vehicle of view. So the more and more YouTube stuff we do, or we all do, and there's more work to be done on this. I don't have a good answer yet, but we've been tweeting stuff or doing stuff on Facebook. Certainly, that's not the vehicle of choice for the youth because that's not their favorite social media platform. But one of my coworkers, JP, is really good at Twitter and other things, so that's really helping. And then we need a few more youth spokespersons. RHR has been, Remote Ham Radio has been good at bringing in youth to use their equipment remotely and allowing them to get on the air. So they may not have the money or the real estate to build the station, but once they see the technology, some of them really like it. And I've seen this work. I had my wife's niece was here at the cottage last summer. And she's actually from Russia, but she's here at school and everything and been here for a long time. So she was asking about my Maestro, which is sitting on my desk here in the living room. And the Maestro is one of the control head interfaces for a Maestro, for a FlexRadio. So I showed her about it, and then I told her about shortwave radio, and I put on some AM broadcast, and I had her listen to that, and then it was now later, so 40 meters, put the headphones on her and taught her how to tune around and to ask me questions. And 3 hours later, she was still dialing around. She thought it was incredible. Now, she's since told me she'd like to get more into it, but she's still tied up with school. But I think the exposure, and we have to find the right vehicle for that exposure to get to them.
One of the problems that we seem to have is that radios that consumers buy now, if they buy radios at all, are channelized. They go to your FM station, but they don't go in between. And the AM radios are kind of like this as well, so that you don't actually have the knob, and you actually don't have the ability to kind of hear what's in between, so that you might hear those shortwave stations and actually spark your imagination in terms of the fact that you're hearing something that's not internet-based, that's floating through the air that happens to be 10,000 miles away.
Correct. I think, we have a bunch of guys here in Ontario that are really good at the weak signal stuff, and they've actually convinced a bunch of us to get on 10 gig too. And they're being seen actually standing on, with this equipment on highway overpasses. So I still think we need to be front and center and figure out ways to get in front of people.
Do more operating from parks, for example.
Yes.
Where you're actually taking the ham radio out into the public and demonstrating to them, showing them that ham radio is still alive. Do you have a 30-second elevator pitch for when somebody asks you, ham radio, there's people are still doing that?
I do. It's, I generally say it's, let's see, let me spin this. So my 30-second pitch is, it's social distancing at its best, but you still get to be really social with people all over the world. And it's sort of about it. It's just there's just no end to it. If you're inquisitive of all, then you need to look at ham radio because there's just so much that can entice your mind.
Do you have advice to new or returning hams to the hobby?
I do. Ask questions, get involved, find an Elmer or nag someone to be your Elmer, and just keep asking questions and learn. Don't forget to try something. Get a hunk of wire up in the air, whether it's on FM or VHF or UHF or HF. There's so much to do that, and you don't have to spend the same amount of money on it we used to.
Michael, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It's been a blast. I really appreciate it. 73.
Eric, I've loved it. Yeah, 73. Thank you so much for having me. Take care, 73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Michael. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topic that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in VA3MW in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the menu item at the top of the page or the banner ad to get to the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, running now in on-demand mode until September 9th. All of the speakers in the auditorium and most of the Q&A recording links are also on the presentation description. I want to thank ICOM America for sponsoring this episode of QSO Today. Please visit www.icomamerica.com/amateur to get to ICOM's line of high-quality amateur radio products. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor any of these episodes into written text, please push the button in the middle of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the top of the show notes page. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on a host of platforms including Spotify, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and the iTunes Store. A list of these services is on the right side of the show notes page. Stitcher is still my favorite podcast manager. My thanks to my friend and colleague Ben Bresky, who makes every QSO Today interview guest and this host sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.